Do you know the really cool thing about the brain? It's the executive function of everything in your body that you do. For example, when you feel pain in your finger, you don't actually feel it in your finger. The signal travels up to your brain says it's pain, and it says you feel it in your finger. That's why people who have amputated limbs say, I can still feel my toes, because their brain still says you're feeling this in your toes, even though their toes don't exist. The brain runs on sugar. Now, too much sugar is a bad thing. It's a bad thing for the brain. It's a bad thing for your body. It's a bad thing for every nerve. Anybody who's had neuropathy understands that. And that same problem can happen with the brain. And so some people have said, well, isn't really dementia type 3 diabetes? And there is some evidence that there's some insulin resistance in the hippocampus of the brain. Now, what is that? The hippocampus is what's responsible for short-term memory. When you see MRI scans of brains, and they say someone has Alzheimer's, we can tell because their hippocampus has gotten smaller. Their ability to retain short-term memory is smaller. They'll remember things from 40 years ago with clarity, but they won't remember what you did yesterday. It turns out that one of those genetic predispositions for Alzheimer's codes for a protein called GLUT4, which helps you bring glucose into that part of the brain. So if it gets starved of glucose, it can't perform its function and it has a problem. Now this happens over time. It doesn't happen right away. Kids aren't born with that, even though they have that gene. So what does that tell us? It tells us that over a lifetime, you can modify that behavior. You can modify that behavior by eating a better diet, like the Mediterranean diet. You can modify that behavior by utilizing your brain more. And even though people will say, well, the brain can function on ketones, it can't. Do you know what ketones are like? Ketones are like that little tiny spare tire. It's good for a little while. It's not good for a long time. Your brain tightly regulates the glucose it controls because when it only has a limited supply of glucose, it'll put it to its more complex executive functions like keeping you breathing. And when we find someone who's completely comatose, we check their blood sugar. If it's below 40, we know they're in trouble and we give them glucose, which is blood sugar, stat. We give them a ton of it. But again, too much blood sugar has the same problems. You get a neuropathy of the brain, which isn't good. But that doesn't mean you have license to call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. It's way more complicated than that. But the brain, it's really cool. So, you want to prevent Alzheimer's? Use more of your brain.